All right, well, welcome back to session 2 of Cross-Cultural Organizations, Technology and the Poor. I wanted to start off and do a recap of part 1. What we really try to do is we're trying to do a survey of a lot of the concepts that are important to working with the poor and using technology. So some of the main ideas that in the first section we're hoping to get across is just understanding low-cost business models and understanding a lot of these concepts that are likely to be reducing the cost of production of information and other products, like the long tail, open source, zero marginal cost, and that we should use those trends to the poor. And part of what that can also do is it can reverse the trend of the secularization of media and the westernization of media. Now, as I've been interacting with all of you in the forums, there's just a few other things I wanted to just kind of emphasize as I, talked with people. One is that the reason why I have you read about the bottom of the pyramid, one is to understand the global perspective on bottom of the pyramid, but also I like for people to think about that domestically, because I think a lot of the concepts apply to the bottom, serving the bottom 20% in any society. They're slightly different, but I think that they can be applied to serving the poor in the U.S., can be applied to serving the poor in any given society. So that's one key thing I'm hoping that people get. The other thing is, I've read tons of books about tech concepts, and what I've tried to do in this course is, out of the thousands of concepts out there, what are the 5 that are most important, or what are the few that are the most important to understand when serving the poor? I've been, using technology to serve the poor for, almost over 15 years now, and worked with hundreds of organizations, and these are the key things that just keep coming up again and again. So we need to really understand these concepts, like the long tail, and understand how do we partner with these forces rather than work against them. The common theme, as I emphasized before, is that they all reduce the cost of production and the price to consumers. So part of what I would encourage you to do, because this course is really a survey, and what a survey does is it kind of makes you jack of all trades, but a master of none. So if you really want to master these things, what you need to do, almost all the concepts that I've shared with you and the videos that I've had you watch, there's books written on them. And part of the reason why I had the video is because it's Cliff Notes, and if I had you read all the books, there'd be 3,000 or 5,000 pages of reading. So I thought I'd spare you that. But if you find concepts really interesting, I would encourage you to read the books behind them. One of the other takeaways I want to have in the course is that, a lot of you have heard the phrase, the key to success in business is there's 3 things you need to focus on: location, location, and location. And I would say you could translate that in serving the poor is cost, cost, cost for a lot of the business models serving the poor. I mean, there's more to it than that, just like there's more to location, but you have to really think about cost, and that's a lot of what people don't consider. So the last takeaway, and this is from the reading I just added, and it's a quote that comes from the Economist article on the new freelance economy, and I think that this is a key thing to think about in working with the poor. Is they say that the world is increasingly becoming divided between people who have money but no time and people who have time but no money. So part of what that means is that the poor have an asset. They have time but no money, so that really gives an opportunity. So as you're thinking about, as the economy changes, what are the areas where having time but not money is useful? So I'll talk about that a little bit later. And one of the examples is, why are rescue missions and Salvation Army, why are they into the thrift store business? Well, this is an example of how you could apply one of the principles. So, they work with the poor, and after they work with the poor, they try to get them jobs, and they need self-sustaining jobs that, the poor can do. So one of those is thrift stores. So a lot of the work in thrift stores is very time intensive. You have to go through books, you have to sort through a lot of materials and see whether it make sense. What's happening with the rich more and more is they just don't have time, so they throw everything out. So thrift stores is becoming the key to thrift stores. Understanding this separation between the people with time and no money and the money without no time is how can you provide a service to people with money and no time so that you utilize their assets by utilizing people with time and not money. Now, part of how that's useful is the thrift store business is changing. eBay, Craigslist, a lot of other things are dramatically changing that business. And I think that understanding that as a central theme could help guide how are you going to adapt thrift stores. So another example of how you might apply these principles, and in your assignment, I asked you to apply these, and some of you may have come up with some of these concepts, some of you may not have, and it's not like there's a right concept or not, but these are some of the concepts that I've thought about that could be helpful. For Rescue Mission, Salvation Army, for them, the freelance economy, for some people it's going to be an oppressive force, but for other people it could be an employment on-ramp. So The Economist talked about the person who was cleaning people's houses but was homeless. Well, on the internet, the saying goes, no one knows that you're a dog is the quote. The internet also provides opportunities for people who may not be able to get into traditional work markets, but they might be able to start cleaning houses, even, and the people don't need to know that they're homeless, and that becomes a way that they can get on their feet and then get jobs. Now, if there's a long-term, suppressing of wages for people in that sector, then that's a bigger issue. But for people who are just trying to get on the first rung of the ladder, it can be a big opportunity. The other thing that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about is, as we move from the industrial age to the information age, I often spend time thinking about, okay, what is the digital analogy of the key concepts of these business models in rescue missions and the Salvation Army? How would you translate the concept of bell ringing? How would you translate the concept of thrift stores? And how does that adapt as we move into the information age? So those are some interesting questions, I think, to think about. Another category is for people who are doing tech consulting. So, what I would say the key thing there would be, how do you partner with tech Christians in the developing world? So that's going to be a key bottom of the pyramid or base of the pyramid question. So, again, you have people in the West whose time, the tech Christians in the West might be billing at over $100 an hour, but there are Christians in India and other parts of the country or parts of the world that, $100 an hour, they could feed their family for a long time for just a few hours. So, so there's an opportunity, and you have a natural community among Christians. So, that would be an interesting topic. So part of what I'm doing is I'm trying to, help give you some ideas for topics to explore. If you're a tech consultant, then you might look at, okay, how could I develop a partnership, and what are the models of Christians that are doing this type of thing? And then, the other one would be if you're a tech consultant and, you do a lot of your consulting for profit, then I would encourage you to, think about how could you also, do what lawyers do, offer pro bono or reduce cost consulting. And I would encourage most tech folks to look more at the reduced cost consulting. You might bill at $100 an hour, but there might be a ministry you bill to them at $20 an hour. And looking at models of that and learning from other people doing that. And then the education sector, some of you are helping train the poor and things along those lines. Part of what we found helpful is partnering with open education and long tail resources, because what that's going to do is going to help you reduce costs and promote diversity. So each of these things could, what I'm hoping to do is to kind of give you some ideas that might help you think about, okay, so here's some of the ways that I could be thinking about ideas for projects. In some cases, it might be exactly what you're working on. It might be something your employer is doing. or the organization that you're with, or a project that you want to do in the future. But I would encourage you to think about your project and how it might apply some of these concepts. And you can read through the full syllabus of everything we're covering, because we're wanting you to cover kind of the goal of the final project is to give you something where you can apply the concepts that you've learned in this course. So, and it should be something useful. If you just do something to go through the ropes, then I feel like we've all wasted our time. So that's a big part of it. So with that, I'm going to go into part 2 of technology and cross-cultural ministry. One of the things you're going to read, if you haven't already, and part of it is, if I were taking this course, I think I would listen to my talk and then, read through the material. So what I'm giving you is an introduction to the material, but then you might listen to it if you wanted to really understand how everything fits together. So one of the first things that we're going to try to cover is the concept of cultural distance and mission. So Ralph Winter is really the pioneer in that space, and he's talked about different forms of evangelism. And he talks about in the paper, he talks about E0 evangelism, and what that is really renewal of Christians of the same culture. And that's really what that is it's discipleship, and that's something important. I feel like that's one of the cores that I'm strong at. Then there's E1 evangelism, and that's evangelizing to people of the same culture. A lot of people have promoted the concept that churches should be monocultural because they grow more quickly that way, and to a certain extent that's true. There's also advantages to doing it otherwise, but I think part of what we found is that a lot of the churches are of the same culture, and it can be easier for you to say evangelize to someone who has a lot of similarities to you. E2 is cross-cultural missions, so that might be you going into if you're from United States and come from a middle-class background, going into a low-income Latin American community, different language, it's still Western, so I would say that's probably going to be E2, and E3 would be a radically different culture where you might be going into a tribal culture of Native Americans, or some sort of indigenous tribe where you don't speak the same language, where there's no common Western culture, and it's a radically different shift. So the idea is it's really important to be able to gauge the cultural distance so that you understand what you're signing up for. And one of the things that I found that Christians tend to really not recognize the cultural distance. So they make the mistake of only doing E0, it's just the church serving itself, evangelism, or you have a lot of people who may not be particularly gifted at cross-cultural ministry trying to only do cross-cultural mission. So, they might come from a upper middle class background and might be white and go into a low-income, black neighborhood, or Latino neighborhood, where I'd say, even though that's Western culture, they don't recognize that that's, probably closer to E2 evangelism, either E1.5 or E2 evangelism, and it's fairly challenging. Where it might be easier to do E1 evangelism, where you're working with people of the same culture. So if you have the combination of race, class, ethnicity, gender, and then you're crossing all those barriers, it's a lot farther. So one of the key principles in urban ministry and urban missions is the idea of indigenous leadership development. And to translate that into Ralph Winter's language, it's this statement in the box. If there are Christians indigenous to a culture, then the role of tech should be to support E1 evangelism, or indigenous leaders. So a lot of what Tech Mission, I'm not saying that's exclusively should be the role, but I think that's where it's most effective. So what Tech Mission has tried to do in City Vision, largely what we try to do is we try to raise up indigenous leaders or people who are going to train indigenous leaders. And I think that that's, one of the biggest advantages, because if you look at what happened with Paul and just how the church grows, Paul would go, plant a church, and he would say, I'm a Jew to the Jews and a Greek to the Greeks, and he's doing cross-cultural missions. But then he would leave someone indigenous there to take over. And if you look at the growth of Christianity, it's usually whenever the indigenous leaders take over that it starts to explode exponentially. So that's the concept of cultural distance. That's what I'm hoping you get out of that paper. Now, the next several concepts really are ways to assess cultural distance. And there's different ways of thinking about culture. One is, in probably the most commonly used dimensions of looking at culture, is Hofstede's cultural dimensions, and there's different aspects of Hofstede's cultural dimensions. So there's a power distance index, and what that is, are you in a society that has a lot of deference for those who are in power? Are you in a society that everyone wears the same clothes and everyone's at the same level? So those societies that have a power distance index are going to be more hierarchical. They're going to be, So then there's individualism versus collectivism. So an individualistic culture is one, I would say more like the United States, where the emphasis is focused on individual values. Collectivist culture is much more like China or India, where the value is much, more, we often will judge China and we say, they're doing everything, the individual is sacrificed for the sake of the country. And, the individual freedoms are sacrificed for what the leadership thinks is best for the country. But there's that's a difference in culture. The other one is uncertainty avoidance. There's some cultures that are very avoidant of uncertainty, others that are more accepting, and you're going to read about these in the link that we have in your assignment. Then there's masculinity versus femininity, long-term orientation. So, the United States has been criticized for being, in many ways, a short-term oriented society, where it's all about the next paycheck. It's all about the next quarter's stock price. The indulgence versus restraint. And if you want to learn more about these, you can actually download some apps. So that's the link to the mobile apps. There's also a video that kind of maps out different parts of the world and how they fit into Hofstede's cultural theory. So hopefully that'll be helpful. So that's one of the dimensions to understanding culture, to understanding cultural distance. The other one is the class dimension, and Christians rarely talk about class. I think there's been some good reasons, largely because of the communist push. Class, discussing about class was focused around, and I'm talking about social class, so your socioeconomic status. There, for a long time, discussion around class was associated with being communist, which it largely meant being anti-Christian. But class is one of the dimensions to learn about in terms of class as culture. Now, a lot of people don't think of class as culture. They only think of class in terms of how much money someone makes. But there's a lot of dimensions to class. My paper talks about that. But the biggest shift that I see is with ministries is the importance of recognizing, okay, here's my needs and here's the needs of others. So most of you have seen this pyramid. It's called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And the basic idea behind it is that you have to meet some basic needs, or there's needs that feel more pressing often before you move on to other needs. So if you're about to starve to death, die of lack of water or exposure to the elements, then you need to focus on the physiological needs. Then after that, it's safety and security. So protection from violence, protection from trauma. Most of the poor that you're working with, those are their main two things. They're constantly re-traumatized, constantly exposed to violence. Housing's not secure. So those are the lower class needs, and there's different types of ministries over on the left. So you have housing ministry, food ministry, global relief, for physiological. You have safety and security, so educational job programs, after-school programs, medical ministry, and belongingness and love, so small groups, youth groups, social activity, counseling. And then, you get into leadership development, personal identity development, and then, finding your calling, self-esteem, self-actualization. Now, if you look at what are the needs that middle-class churches focus on, it's largely the top of that pyramid. But then, if you look at the parachurches that serve the poor, it's largely the bottom of that pyramid. And it's important to recognize that difference because we come in with our own, cultural lens, and it can be easy to say that the top of the pyramid is more important because those are the spiritual needs, whereas the bottom part, the physical needs, aren't important. And, the Bible basically, Jesus always met physical and spiritual needs. The Lausanne Conference is the largest kind of gathering of evangelicals started by Billy Graham. Affirms that you have to always meet physical and spiritual needs. So we care about the whole pyramid, but we also have to recognize where people are. And as we're serving people, recognize, it's like being married. You have to focus on what your spouse's needs are, what your child's needs are, not what you're needing in loving them. So, and that's part of what we do in ministry. So, part of what I talk about in reconciliation across social class is a lot of the dimensions of classist culture. And often there are dimensions that are in tension against each other. So, I talk about non-dominant class and dominant class in the paper. As a quick summary, dominant class is middle class and above. Non-dominant class is what I would say is working class and the poor. Although that's a overgeneralization. So you have different needs. So non-dominant class, if you look at how they're going to prioritize, they're usually going to be buying things that are more low cost. So if they have to pick between low cost and high quality, they're going to go for low cost. If they have to decide low cost and speed, if you go to urban discount stores, often there's long lines. They're willing to tolerate the long line as long as they can get lower cost. So speed's less important. Then there's other tensions like, how structured and orderly is something going to be versus relational. A lot of urban churches are very relational, and then other, groups might be structured and orderly. Efficient. This is one where I actually, have a hard time. Because I have an engineering background, I'm very efficiently focused, even though I'm fairly relational. But whenever it's efficiency versus relational, it's a real tension. And each person's going to be different. And part of what we're going to do is in the assignment is we're going to have you list, okay, here's my personal preference on each of these things. So, do you prefer to be spontaneous, or do you prefer to be more detached and objective? Do you prefer to the subjective environments and subjective disciplines, or more the objective disciplines? Do you prefer, and are you more intense, or are you more reserved? Are you more hierarchical? Are you more egalitarian? Is trauma common and you're just used to it? Or is trauma avoided so you don't live in places that are going to be high trauma like the city? And really any of the upper class, middle and upper class culture values, and then any lower class values. So as you read that, that's one of the key points I'm wanting you to get. But to translate those in ministry, because as you do ministry, if you're not relational enough and you're working with the poor, if you're get frustrated over the fact that, people are spontaneous, that there's a different understanding of time, that, people are too intense, that, in certain churches that there's a very strong, respect for hierarchy. It just recognize that that's a cultural difference. So, now, some of these cultural differences actually translate into technology. This is really complex. I could have a really long conversation with you, but we've been working in this area for a long time. So there's two aspects of cross-cultural technology. There's the front end of technology. So, obviously, if you have a website and you're trying to serve the Spanish-speaking community and it's not in Spanish and you got the language wrong, that's a problem, right? There's the types of media. How much are you going to be text-focused, image-focused, audio and video? I underline those because, something only like, I forget, 80% of the world can read, or maybe it's, I think it's between 80 and 90%. I'm sorry, only somewhere between 10 and 20% of the world can read. So most of the world's still in oral culture. So audio and video is a pretty good way to reach them. Front-end graphics, if you go to a hip-hop website or, hip-hop graphics are going to be very different than, say a business website. And then there's other things on the front end of, are you going to have open access like Wikipedia? Is it going to be behind a paywall? Is it going to be restricted access where you have to create an account? All those things have big implications on the poor. And then the other thing that is really important is the device. And I'm not going to try to get into the holy wars on which device is better. Google's Android versus iPhone, or Windows versus Mac. But the bottom line is the poor need cheap devices. There's a reason why Android has something like more than 90% market penetration among the poor globally. I think it's close to 95% market penetration. Is because it's the cheap device. So whenever we work with the poor, we often will look at the architectural models that Google is using more than that Apple's using. I would say Google is focused much more on architecture for the poor, whereas Apple is focused on architecture for the upper middle class. Then on the back end in development, so how much are things going to cost? And then the other big thing is content economics. So if you look at all the content in the world, and I think I talk about this, 99% is owned by just a few companies and some of the richest people in the world. So the internet's changing that so that there's a lot more creators of content. You look at YouTube, it's not the big corporations that are creating all the content. You look at Wikipedia, it's the same thing. So the content economics, and that's one of the things hopefully you got out of Binker's book in the peer production, is that if you change the economics of the content, then you're going to dramatically change how the world works. And more and more, and I can't remember the exact stat, but I think something like over half the economy now revolves around intangible assets and information and services. I think it's something like 80%. So if you get more and more of that is open and reducing the cost in that 80% of the economy, then that's going to make the whole society more affordable. Then the other thing is information architecture. So is it going to be open? Is it going to be closed? Are you using a hub spoke? Are you using a distributed model? All those things have cross-cultural dimensions. I could probably give a whole 2-hour talk on that, but that's just the high level. So the other way you can look at, one was Holstead's looking at cultural distance that way. 2 is looking at social class. The third one is ethnic identity development. So this is an important concept for people to get. One of the biggest books that people read, it's called Why Are the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And that book has that title because for a lot of white folks, trying to explain culture is trying to explain water to a fish. You're always surrounded by majority culture, but if you often, are in environments where you're working cross-culturally, then it's easier to understand your own culture. So what ethnic identity development does is it breaks up the stages of people's own understanding of their culture, their own ethnic identity. And I've broken it down into 4 stages and used Christian terms in the paper. A lot of the other people break it up into 6, but I just like to simplify it. Most people in the United States are in stage 1. They're essentially unaware of their own racial and social identity. And it is synonymous with the I don't see color, I'm colorblind. That statement in itself could be good in some ways, but in many ways it's saying what I don't see is I don't see the cultural differences. And if you treat your spouse, if you're married, or treat other people as if they're the same as you, they're not going to like that. And the same thing happens cross-culturally. So it's only by understanding the differences. So stage 2 awareness. Most people who get involved in urban ministry or missions get to that stage. So they're aware of race, culture, and racism, but they're mainly processing it on a head level. So the goal there is to become aware of racism and other forms of social injustice by immersion. So that's how the fish learns what water is. It goes out of the water and it's in air, and all of a sudden it says, that's what water is. It's what I breathe everywhere. So, for me, I spent 3 months in South Africa. I spent, summer working in in a rescue mission. I've spent, most of my life bouncing between the inner city and the suburbs. So I've had a lot of opportunity for that. But this is part of the reason why CCDA and their 3 values, it's a big Christian justice organization. One of their values is relocation, move into the city. It's not an absolute value, but part of the reason is if you live among the poor, then you start to understand, where they're coming from better, and you start to understand your own ethnic identity. So then you get to stage 3. So you're emerging and identifying with the minority culture. So a lot of people, white people, they move into the city, they spend a year in the city, and by the end, honestly, they hate white people, even though they're white. Or to a certain extent for people who are black, and there's, the people who are white or people who are black or Latino, or, who might be in a minority, and this varies depending on, are you a minority in a given cultural context. But what you're doing is you're processing on an emotional level, and you're healing the effects of racism through real relationship. And through real forgiveness. So, and then stage 4 is where you become secure in your own racial and social identity, and you're integrating the strengths from other cultures. You recognize, here's where I fit. I've tried to do E2 and E3 evangelism. You know what? I may not be able to do that, but what I can do is I can support some of the people who are doing that, or I can support E1 leaders, and I can raise up these indigenous leaders. And not everyone's going to end up, there's a lot of people who are gifted to do E3 evangelism, but it's recognizing, where you are in this process. So the last part, what I want to talk with you about is how Tech Mission and City Vision views the world. And part of this is you're going to have an assignment later where you're going to be essentially saying, here's where I'm a bridge builder. And this example is actually so that you can look at how Tech Mission, and even myself personally, have viewed, what's my role as a bridge builder? Because each of us are going to be between different communities. So Tech Mission's 3 values are Jesus, justice, and technology. So that's Tech Mission is the parent of City Vision, parent organization. So there's the Jesus justice sector, and that's the Christians who are serving the poor. There's the Jesus tech sector, that's the Christians who are using technology with the poor. And then there's the tech justice sector, that's secular, it's not Christians. So what we are, if I had to say, what is the summary of what City Vision's trying to do? What's the summary of what Tech Mission's trying to do? Is we're trying to be bridge builders between all 3 of these communities. So if you look at, we have our programs. So City Vision College, Christian volunteering, City Vision internships. Those are all focused primarily on the Jesus justice sector, Christians who serve the poor. And then there's the Jesus tech sector. So our master's program in technology and ministry is really focused more on the Jesus tech sector, crossing over into the Jesus justice sector. Then there's all the different groups out there in the Jesus justice sector. So there's Christian social sector, so Association of Gospel Rescue Missions, Christian Community Development Association, Salvation Army, Teen Challenge, Urban Youth Workers Association, World Vision, Compassion International. So all those groups. Then there's a lot of other groups that people may not recognize that are part of this sector. So there's Christian higher education that's training people for justice. So there's a lot of different schools that are doing that. There's Christian higher education in developing countries. There's churches of the poor. Might be in developing countries, might be in developed countries, made up of the poor. Then there's Christians doing recovery. National Association of Christians in Recovery, Celebrate Recovery. And then there's groups doing urban internships, so Mission Year and in our program, City Vision internships. So part of what we're trying to do is how do we use tech, how do we take some of the skills from these other sectors to grow this sector? So we're trying to diffuse innovation across those. So then there's this other sector, there's the Christian tech sector. And this sector is largely focused on promoting the word. They're focused more on evangelism. They're focused more on the top half of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, whereas the Jesus Justice sector is focused more on the bottom half. And there you have a lot of different groups, and I want you guys to become aware of these, and I cover these in the other class too, but I want you to become aware of this sector because this is a sector that you need to know who the players are. So there's the technology and missions groups that are out there, and you can Google a lot of these names. There are tech-focused Christian colleges and Christian college groups, or there's technology programs within those. There's groups of Christian technologists, so Christian Engineering Society. There's different faculty groups with InterVarsity and Cru. We have a Facebook group called Christians in Technology with a few thousand people in a LinkedIn group. Actually, the LinkedIn group's the larger one. Code for the Kingdoms. And then, there's other churches that are doing tech and IT, especially in mega churches. So Life Church, they're the people who came up with the Bible app doing phenomenal things with technology. Technology and Ministry, and Evangelism Day. Then there's parachurches doing IT. There's Christian recruiting, Christian media like Christianity Today. So what we try to do is we try to get these two worlds talking. We try to get groups that are more focused on the poor, Christians more focused on the poor, and Christians that are more focused on the resource groups, talking and sharing resources. And then the other thing we do is we partner with non-Christians, and a lot of the innovation comes from this sector. So open source, we work a lot with Drupal. We've contributed a lot, and I think are fairly respected. Evan's fairly respected in the Drupal community. Moodle, we work with them. We are working a lot with the open education movement. We're partnering with Straighterline, MOOCs. We're looking at MOOCs a lot, edX, Coursera. A lot of the other groups doing nonprofit recruiting, we've partnered with them. Then there's groups that are doing low-cost online training, job boards. We've partnered with a lot of those. There's secular funders. There's tech philanthropy. We get Google grants. We get some of the philanthropy from LinkedIn, Salesforce, Microsoft, all those things. And then there's open data. So what we're trying to do is to bridge a lot of these innovations. So how do you use these innovations that's coming from open education, open source, into these other sectors? And that's a lot of what we've been trying to do. So part of what I would encourage you to do is you can build your own map of, and think about, what are the groups that you're trying to bridge in your life. So the next part of what I want to talk about is this concept of diffusion of innovation. We're going to talk a lot more about it in section 3, but I think what's important is to recognize where we fall in a bridge. So if you view the world as a big bridge, and everyone needs to be reached through E3 evangelism, but not everyone needs to do it. So you start with serving the poor, and then you say, okay, how are we going to most effectively serve the poor? Well, there's different types of ministry. There's ministry of the poor, and that could be E0 evangelism. Then there's ministry to the poor, and I would say that's by definition largely E2 evangelism if it's to the poor. But then there's ministry with the poor, and to do that well, you need to be closer to E1 evangelism. How are you training indigenous leaders? So, your ministry. You work with the poor. Now, the next part of this is what tech ministries can do. I would say that the biggest thing most tech ministries can do is to support the ministries that are working with the poor. So, how can I resource Salvation Army? How can I resource all these thousands of local ministries? Can I provide low-cost consulting to them? That honestly is going to be one of the biggest benefits you can do. A lot of people want to go to the front lines and be the hero. That's great. Sometimes that's what God's called you to do, but I think more often what you're called to do is to be someone behind the scenes, especially the tech folks, that's providing the infrastructure for the people on the front lines. Then you have this other community here where you have Christians who are working in secular technology. So a lot of times what I see is this group will go straight to try to serve the poor. They don't partner with the ministry serving the poor. They try to work directly with them, and they're essentially doing E2 or E3 evangelism, which is rarely effective. So what you really want to do is you want to build up the bridges, and sorry there's so many arrows on this, but you want to build up the bridges between Christians and secular tech and these other groups. So I went to a group, Code for the Kingdom, that was largely Christians that are working in secular companies. Their knowledge of technology was off the hook. We had a lot to teach them about justice, so that's why the arrow is pointing down for justice. I had a lot to learn from them about tech. So that's how the diffusion of innovation happens. So they need to learn, about justice. We need to learn about tech. So that's the type of partnership there. And then you have the tech ministries. So that's more on that sector that I said, the Jesus Tech sector. And those groups often, need to learn more about justice, especially if they've been focused largely on, serving resource Christians. But a lot of times they have a lot more innovation than tech ministries with the poor. So, whenever GospelCom was still around, I learned a lot about how to do technology ministry, and I still learn from a lot of these big Christian tech companies, observing what YouVersion's doing and things like that. And then there's other innovation where you're trying to get the secular nonprofit tech. So what I'm trying to do is to draw a diagram of all the ways that innovation gets diffused. And so you have secular nonprofit tech. So that's a lot of where we learn things. And then there's secular tech. I often will listen to videos on Google and things along those lines. So the end goal isn't that everyone is the hero and they do E3 evangelism, going from, working at the highest levels of Google to working, directly with the poor in a developing country. The better way is the people at Google teach me the latest stuff at tech, because I'm going to work with the ministries of the poor, and then I can train them, and then they're going to work with the poor directly. So that's the point of this, is that we need to have different stages. So I realize this is complex. I'm going to cover this again in the next section, because I think it's one of the key points. So the main ideas from this section, one is just to understand the concept of cultural distance. And, E0 is, essentially doing discipleship, and E3 is dramatic cultural difference, and then the different measures of cultural difference. So culture, social class, ethnicity. And then the second takeaway is, I'm hoping that people after this talk and after reading these things will, understand the importance of using technology either to support Indigenous leaders, E1 ministries, if there are Indigenous Christians, or supporting cross-cultural missions, E2 or E3 if there aren't. So there's a lot of missions agencies that are sending people doing E2 or E3 evangelism to unreached people groups, and that's critical to support them with technology, but that doesn't mean every tech person is going to be doing E3 evangelism. Then I think the third thing is just to explain, this is really complex. Using technology in cross-cultural settings. It's not to discourage people, but it's to try to get people to be humble. If you make a mistake, just acknowledge sorry about that, and learn. And really the only way to learn this, largely you can read all the books you want, but it's like someone who studied a language. You can study the books in the language, but what you'll learn by being immersed in that country for 3 months is going to be more than everything you could learn in the books. And it's the same thing in working with the poor is finding opportunities, for immersion. And then, the fourth point, and this is really where the exercises are focused, is, we need to understand ourselves, but we need to find our own role as bridge builders and to form partnerships to maximize the diffusion of innovation and to leverage existing cultural competencies. So if there's a black pastor who's leading a revival in the black church in Boston, I don't need to start a new church. I need to go use my tech to help train their people, provide low-cost consulting for their website, to train their web designers, or things along those lines. So let me just go into the assignment. So there's two assignments. One's the cross-cultural ministry assignment, and really what you're going to do there is you're going to be listing the cultural dimensions of you and your organization, and I have an Excel spreadsheet where you're going to do that. So this is what the Excel spreadsheet looks like. And you're going to go through and you're going to put your value preference. So, do this after reading, the paper, and then you put your organization's value preference. And the whole purpose of this exercise is to recognize, okay, here are some ways that my personality actually works well with the poor. Here's ways where I'm likely to have a rub. Then the same type of thing around Hofstede's cultural dimensions. And here I just suggest that you either make it bold or you use it and you highlight it a different culture for what your own preference is, and then submit that. And then in the second part, so that's the first part. And in the second part, what you're going to be doing is you're going to talk about your own history of ministry. What have you done around E0, E1, E2, E3 evangelism? What lessons have you learned? And then, what communities do you serve as a bridge builder between, and how can you make that more effective? And how do you see that changing for yourself? So basically, reflect on these. How does it personally apply to you, both in your history and in things that you can some takeaways. Then the second part is the final project. You're going to do a couple things. One thing that I want to emphasize is that there is the book review section of your final project, and for each of these videos and each of these papers, because this course we didn't do books, we did a lot of smaller either videos or papers. We're not going to have you do a page or a page and a half on the books. What we're going to do is have you just write one paragraph on each handout. So what I'd recommend is that you do that as you go through, because if you wait to the end, you're going to forget what was that video about or what was that thing about. Is right after you read something, the whole purpose of it is to, there's two reasons why we have you do this. One is it's just, an idea like taking notes is going to help you remember it better. So if you have to summarize what you learned from that, then you're going to remember it better. The other purpose is, part of accreditation is we have to document that you've, done these things, that you've learned these things. So that's the other, purpose of that. And then in the final project, there's some other instructions of what we're wanting you to do. What I want you to do is I'm wanting you to revise it, and I'm going to give you all feedback. You should have some feedback from me probably by the time you watch this. But I'm going to be giving you feedback, and I want you to write a proposal and then think about where can you learn. So some of you might be at a rescue mission, and you're running a computer center rescue mission. I want you to learn from 5 other rescue missions. Some of you might be doing consulting. I want you to learn from other Christians doing consulting effectively and serving the poor, or working in different parts of the world cross-culturally. And then there could be other opportunities. So the idea is you're going to spend some time researching, one, but two, I want you to be calling people and to learn, call up a rescue mission and say, I have this class project. Part of it is to do research. Do you have a grant you've written? Grants are one of the best sources you can get, or for your program. Do you have something that summarizes your program? And ask if you can use that, and ask if you can interview that person and take some notes. So that's what the final project is. We're trying to wrap up the final project this at least the plan this time so that you can start working on it. And I would encourage you to start working on it because, close to 3/4 of your grade is going to be in the final project. So what you want to start doing is you want to start to, be, working on some of the sections for your final project. So if you have any questions, just send them to me and come back again for part 3, where we'll be talking about the digital divide, the knowledge divide, and the Christian response.